Today I'm going to solve Petri Dish by Blobz. If you would like to try this puzzle for yourself, it'll be the first link in the description, and let's have a look at the rules. Normal sudoku rules apply, so we're going to place the digits 1 to 9 once each in every row, every column, and every box. A microbe has been placed in cell row 1, column 1 of the Petri dish, which is the grid. It infects all adjacent cells, both orthogonally and diagonally, that are either the same digit or consecutive to that digit. The infected cell or cells become a microbe and will in turn infect adjacent cells, if they contain the same or consecutive digits. The complete growth of the microorganism of this experiment has been shown. A negative constraint applies here. A white cell adjacent orthogonally or diagonally to a microbe cell cannot be consecutive or contain the same digit. Okay, so this cell is going to infect this one, which will in turn infect this one, which will in turn infect this one. This one will infect this one. Now here, I think we have 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1 is that this infects both of those at the same time. Scenario 2 is that this infects this one first, and then this one is the one that infects this one. And scenario 3 is that this infects this one, and then this infects that one. And so there's a certain amount of understanding the growth pattern. So we have reached a point of stability because the complete growth of the microorganism has been shown. So there are no cells that could be infected that aren't already. And we know that if that's infected, this can't be consecutive or the same as this one, because that is a white cell. It would have been infected by this point. Okay, in the unaffected growth medium, the empty white cells, white dots separate consecutive digits. So those two are consecutive. All such dots are shown. So within the white area, those two cannot be consecutive. That constraint only applies orthogonally within the white area. Okay, I am going to restart the puzzle to reset the timer, and let's begin. Well, we have a good start because this one can only infect a 2, so that must be there. 2 can infect a 2, 3, or 1, and that can either be 2 or 1, so that must be a 3. 3 can infect 2, 3, or 4, so that has to be a 4. And I think, given that we have a lot of consecutiveness, that odd and even are going to be prominent. So I am going to mark odds and evens to try and help me see that. So orange for odd because they both start with O, blue for even because that is a good contrast to the orange. Now, the reason that odd and even stuff is important, so first of all, consecutiveness, 2 consecutive digits have to be one of each odd and even parity. And so that means that across a white dot, we know that we have odd even parity. We know that infected cells within adjacent affected cells within a sudoku house, so a row, column, or box, must be odd and even parity. So for example, this has to be odd because it can't be the same digit as the 4. So that is 3 or 5. This this is now complex because that could infect both of these at the same time, which if it did would make them both even. But if this infects this one first, that could then infect that one, making that odd. Interesting. Okay, let us consider a bit more up here. I can't put 4 in any of those because the 3 would have infected that cell. That can't be a 4, so that's a 4. That makes this odd and is 3 or 5. 5 can't be in either of those two because I would have a white dot for the 4, and it can't be in those two because the 4 would have infected it, so that must be a 5. Okay. So these are from 6, 7, 8, and 9. That can't go 6, 5, 4. So if that's a 6, that goes 6, 7, 8. If that's, oh, in fact, that can't be a 6 at all because of that 5. Okay, that makes that easier. If this is 7, it can't go 7, 6, 5 because of that 5. So it would go 7, 8, 9. If that's an 8, that has to go 8, 7, 6. And if that's a 9, it has to go 9, 8, 7. Okay. So right, if this is a 3, and this is infected by this cell, then that has to be a 2. If this is a 5, and this is infected by this cell, that has to be a 6. That could be 2, 4, or 6, and then that infect by that. But if that's 2 or 6, then that could be odd, infected by that. Ah, that's a bit gnarly. Okay, we have a 4 in one of those two by sudoku. So if that were a 4, this would have to be odd and couldn't be a 5, so that would be a 3. And that, right, if that were a 4, that would have to be a 3, but because it couldn't be a 5. But that would then have to be a 2, 3, or a 4, which it can't be. So that's not a 4. Okay. That's good to know. So that puts some restrictions on this box. All right. So that can't be a 5 by sudoku. That can't be a 5. That can't be a 5. One of those could be. Could that be a 5? If that were a 3, that could be a 4. That could be a 5. So yes, that could be a 5. In any case, that is even. Ah, okay. So, because there is only one path for the infection to come through into this corner, we know that those two are different parities, as are those two because they're in the same box. Therefore, that is an odd and an even digit. But we also know that that's an odd and an even, and that's an odd and an even. So amongst these cells, we have 4 even digits. So those two are both odd. That feels significant because now that has to be even, that has to be odd, that infected that. Those two could be the same digit. Okay. So that can't be a 7 or a 5 or a 1. That is a 3 or a 9, because 7 is definitely in one of those. But if that were a 9, that would have to be an 8. And it can't be an 8 because 8 is definitely in one of those. So that has to be a 3. That now has to be a 2. That has to be a 1, which makes this a 1 or a 2. Now, if that were a 3, right, so that I think makes that a 3, because if that were 1, we could go 2 to 3. If that were a 2, then it was infected by this cell directly. Yeah, so that's a 3. If that were a 3, well, that is a 3. So with that being a 3, if that infects directly, it's a 2. If it's infected indirectly, then that's a 2 and that's a 1. If that's infected directly, that's a 2. That could be a 1, or it's a 2 or a 4. 1, 2, 4 for that cell. Okay. Here we go. We need a 2 in this column. Has to be in one of those two, but if it were there, it would have been infected by this. So it is not there. That is a 2. And that is even. Let's try the even color. All right, so this cell could be a 1 if it's infected by the 2, or it's a 2 or a 4 if it's directly infected by the 3. Or in fact, it could be a 2 infected by this. Well, right, if it's, sorry, it's not that the infection is making it a 2 or a 4, it's the fact that it was a 2 or a 4 that made it infected. Because the microbes, the way to think of this is the microbes can see the finished grid, and then they are infecting things. So, yes, at that point, it doesn't really matter. So if that's a 1, that has to be a 2. Okay. What does this do for us? What can I... Okay, that can't be a 1, that can't be a 1, that can't be a 1, because that would have been infected by the 2, so that's a 1. And now, that can't be a 1 or a 2, or that would have been infected by this cell. So that's a 4. Uh, 5 can't go here, or it would have been infected by that. It can go there. That's not infected, so the diagonal restriction doesn't apply. Neither of those two can be a 6, or they'd be a white dot, so that is a 6. That makes that 7 and 8. That's now 8, and that's 9. Okay, that removes 8 from all of those. That can't be a 6-7 pair, therefore there must be a 9 in there, so that's not a 9. That is 6, 7, and 9. One of those must be a 9, so one of those is an 8. So that is 5 or 7. Okay, this 2 is infecting this cell. That has to be a 1, 2, or a 3, but it can't be a 1. So that is 2 or... This cell infects this one, so that is 3, 4, or 5. So that is 3 or 5. Here, either this cell infects both of those, or this infects one of them, and then the one that it infects the other. That does not seem entirely obvious to me. Okay. All right. Let's start having a look over here. That's clearly odd. That's clearly even. If that's 4, we could go 5, 6. Or we could go 4, 3, 2. Okay. So one of those is a 4. Feels like that this is the right way to go because I need to understand the order of infections. So if that's a 3, and this is infected directly, then that is 2 or 4. And if that's infected directly, that is also 2 or 4. But if that's infected indirectly, if that's infected directly and then this one, that would be 2 or 4, and then that would be 1 or 5. If that's a 5, oh, no, we haven't finished off our 3 conjecture at the moment. So if that's a 3, that would be 2 or 4 if that's direct. And then that would be 2 or 4 if direct, or it would be 1 or 5 if indirect. So if that's a 3, those are from 1, 2, 4, and 5. If that's a 5, we could get 4 or 6 there. We could get a 4-6 pair if they're both directly infected, or that in fact could be a 5. If that were 4 or 6 and was infected first, that could be 5 or 7. If that were 5 or 6 and infected first, that could be 6 or 7. So there's a ton of different options, and that's quite a challenge. Okay, those can't be 4. That can't be a 4 because that would be consecutive with this. And in fact, Sudoku tells us that. So four is definitely in one of those two. At 4. So if that's a 4, that becomes a 3, 5 pair. In fact, that would be 3, that would be 5. If that's a 4, that's 3, that's 2. If that's a 4, that's a 3, 5 pair, and that breaks that cell, so that's not a 4. If that's a 4, that has to be 3, and that has to be 2. And then what happens, that makes that 5. So if that's a 4, that's a 3, that makes that 5, and that's a 2. So with that being a 5, one of those is a 5 or a 6, at least. One of those is a 5 or a 6. Wait. Hang on. If that's a 4, that's a 3, that's a 2, that's a 5. That's a 5. And so now, one of those is a 6, and the other one is a 7. Because it couldn't be a 5. Because 5 would be there. Okay, if this is 4, that's 3, that's 2. That makes that 5, and also makes that 5. So neither of those can be 5, neither of them can be 4, so one of them is a 6 and the other is a 7. That becomes a 6-7 pair, making that 9, and that 6-7. So that becomes a 6-7 pair. 4, 3, 2. One would be in one of those two. Okay. Let's think about ones, I think. All right. One can't be in either of those. It can't be there, and it can't be there because that would be a 2. So one's out of those. Could there be a 1 in one of those? Yes, 3. Well, it couldn't. No, yes, it could. It could go 3, 2, 1, 1. No. All right. So thinking about ones. One can't be in any of those. If one is not there, then one is in one of those. If one is in one of those, then that's because this was a 3, and then the 2 got infected first. So that would be 3, 2, 1. But that would force a 4 here, which would make that a 3 and that a 2. So neither of those can be a 1, and 1 is in one of those two. Okay. So that's, I hate to say a start, but it's not a, it's a deduction. Okay. Four, three, two makes that a 5, makes that a 5, that's a 6, 7 pair, that's a 9. Okay. That's not a 4. 4 is in one of those two. I keep pressing the wrong button. All right. See, that there are so many options as to how these can be infected around here, because that clearly is infected before either of those. But we could do a path like that. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just, you know, it's not obvious at all. Because those do not have to be different parity. Because that could infect that one and that one at the same time. So if that were, say, a 4, that could be, well, not in that example. If that were a 6, that could be a 5, 7 pair. So, where is... Okay, 2 cannot go on either of those. All right, so 2 is not in any of those by sudoku in the fact that one of those is a 1. So if that's not 2, 3, 4, then first of all, where does the 2 go? And secondly, where does... Okay. Yeah. That's not a 1, 2 pair. If that's not a 2, then 2 must be in one of those 3. So if that's a 2, then that has to have been a 1 or a 3, but it can't be a 1 because the only digits that 1 can no, that's not true. Because that could have been a 1. That would make that a 1. That would make that a 2. Ah, okay. One of those two has to have been infected by this. So that's a gatekeeper cell. In that one has to infect that one, and it has to infect one of those two. I don't know which one, and it could be both. But because it could go this cell, then around this corner, or it could even go like that. But if that were a 1, then one of these would have to be a 2. Okay, if that were a 2, that would have had to have been a 1 or a 3. Can this be a 1? I think is the question I want to ask. If that were a 1, the only place that it could have been infected by is this one. So that would have had to have been a 2, because we know it can't be a 1. So if that were a 2 to make that a 1, that can't also be a 2. And it can't be a 1 by sudoku. So that's not a 1. That feels important. Does that mean that that can't be a 2? No, that could have been a 3 in that case. All right. Two is not in any of those by sudoku. 2 is not in there because there's no white dot between these two cells. So 2 is in one of those 3. But if that's a 3, then that's a 2. And then that's a 1. Ah! Here we go. Right, 2 is not in any of those by sudoku. It is not here because there is no white dot. So that means that 2 is in one of those 3 cells. If that's a 3, then those can't be 2 or they would be microbes. Therefore, if that's a 3, this is a 2. But if that's a 2, this has to be a 1 or a 3, which it cannot be. So that cannot be a 3, that's a 5. Okay. This means that one of these is at least one of those is from 4, 5, and 6. All right, neither of those can be 6. Neither of those can be 6 by sudoku. So 6 is in one of those 3. None of those can be a 3. That could be a 3 with a 2 there. All right. If that's a 2, that's a 1. If that's a 2, that's a 3. If that's 2, then 3 can't be in any of those. Hang on. From an infection standpoint, 3 can't be in any of those cells. So 3 is in one of those 2. Okay. So, yes, none of those can be 3 by infection. That can't be 3 by sudoku. So 3 is in one of those 2. So if that's a 3, that has to be a 2. If that can't be a 3. Right, if that's a 3, Neither of those are 2. So that's a 2 and that's a 1. So if that's 3, that has to be a 2 because it can't be a 4. And if that's 3, neither of those are 2, making that a 2, and that's a 1. So that's a 1 or a 2. If that's a 3, that's a 2. No, wait. Yes, if that's a 3, those can't be 2, so that's a 2, making that 1. And if that's a 3, that's a 2. So that's not a 2. If that's 1, that's a 2. If that's 2, that's a 3. Okay. Right. That can't be a 1 because if that's a 1, that simultaneously has to be a 2 and cannot be. That can't be a 1. That can't be a 1 because that would have to be a 2, but simultaneously cannot be. So 1 is in one of those two. No, that wasn't what I wanted either. Oh. 1 is in one of those two. Nine is in one of those two. Ah, that can't be a 1 because it would have been infected. No, that's not an infected 1. Don't make that mistake. Okay. Right. 5 is in one of those. Let's just put that in so I can feel like I'm making some progress. This is kind of tricky. 7 can't go there. 7 can't go there because it would definitely be next to a 6. All right. If that's 2, that's a 1, that's a 3, and those are 6, 7, 8, 9 between them. Yeah, that all seems reasonable. All right, this 2 is infecting this cell, so that's a 2 or a 3. If that were a 2, then that couldn't be 1, so that would be 1, and that would be 2. All right, 3 can't be in either of those, which we already know because 3 is in one of those two. Meh. What is going on? Right. If 5 makes that 4, then this cell is either infected by the 4 or the 5. but it can't be a 3 or a 4, so it could be a 5 or it could be a 6. So if that 5 makes that a 4, then that is a 5 or a 6. If that 5 makes this a 4, then that's a 6. If that 5 makes either of those a 4, that can't be a 3. That's interesting. Yes. So if either of those is a 4, that's not a 3, therefore it's a 2, and that's a 1. Which makes that 3. Right, if either of those is a 4, that can't be 3, so that makes that 2 and makes that 1. And that now becomes 3. Those 4 become 6, 7, 8, and 9. That would have to be the 7, that would have to be the 6, that would be a 9, that would be an 8. And that would all work. That would be 2, 1, 3. Okay. If that's a 4, then that's 3 and that's 2. But if that's a 4, neither of those can be a 5, okay? So that means that one of them would be a 6, and that would be a 6, 7 pair, because it couldn't be a 6, 5 pair, because that couldn't be a 4. Okay, so we've got something else going on here. All right, if that's a 5, that's right, that is a 5. What is it infecting up here? It can't make a 5 because a 5 in either of those cells would eliminate 4 from the other two. If one of those is a 4 from this 5, then that makes that a 2, a 1, and a 3. So I'm making either a 4 or a 6 here, and if I make a 6, I can't make a 5 to go along with it. It could be 6, 4. So if this infects both of those directly, it's 6, 7, or 6, 4, or... no, that's it. So if that infects directly, it's 4, 6, or 6, 7. If it infects one first, if that, say, were a 4, that 4 would have to make a 3 or a 5 here, which it couldn't do. Because then, oh no, because then we'd have a 4, so that's fine. So if that were a 4, that would be 5. Or 6. If that's 4, that's 5 or 6. Depending, yeah, then that wouldn't be a 4. So if that were 4, where would 3 go in this box? If that were 4, 3 couldn't go there. I feel like I am missing something, but this is tricky. Tricky, tricky, tricky. All right, 2 is definitely not in any of those cells. That can't be a 2, or this would be infected because it's the same or consecutive. That can't be a 2. That's all I should have been looking at. Okay. Those can't be 2s. If that were a 2, it would infect this one regardless of the digit that is. So that can't be a 2. If that were a 2, that would make this a 1, but there's no white dot there, so that can't be a 2, so that's a 2. And now that's a 3, and that's a 4. Okay. So now neither of those can be 5. It can't be 4, so one is a 6, one is a 7, and one was infected by the other. So the 5 infected the 6, and then the 6 infected the 7. But that makes that 9. Goodness. That was tricky and but satisfying to finally figure out. Just had to ask the right question. That 3 makes this a 5. All right, so these 3 digits are 1, 2, 8. No, 1, 8, 9. So that's the 1. So if that's 8 or 9, that has to be 7, 8, or 9. But that can't be a 9 because that can't be infected by that. The only place that this can be infected is by this one. Okay. All right, and that is an odd digit. Okay. Let us think more. That's a 4 by sudoku. That can only have been infected by this cell. So that makes that a 3 or a 5, but we know that 3 is there, so that has to have been a 5. That can only have been infected by this cell, but let's first of all do some sudoku. Right, this cell infected this one. So that 5 makes this a 4, 5, or 6. So that's a 5 or a 6. This cell infected this one. So that is 4, 5, or 6. So that is a 5 or a 6, and that gives us a 5, 6 pair. 1 can't go on here because it would have to go with a 2. 1 can't go there by sudoku. So that's a 1. So these are 7, 8, and 9, and one of those is an 8. So that is 7 or 9. That's 7, 8, 9. That is no longer an 8, making that the 8. That's a 9. And that is 5, 6, or 7. That's not a 5. So one of those two is a 6 because there has to be an even digit there. That makes that a 5. And that a 6. That 2 makes this a 3. That has to be a 5, and that is a 6, 7 pair, and I do not know the order of that just yet. Okay. So what is going on here? I can't have 1 or 2 in there because of the 3, 4, 5. And in fact, I could just look at Sudoku and put a 1, 2 there. I can actually remove the 7 from there. That's a 7. That is 8, 9. That has to be 9, 8, 7, and 6. Very nice. There would be a white dot there if that were a 7. So that's a 6 and that's a 7. There we go. And that makes that 6 and that 7. There would be a white dot there if that were an 8. So that's a 9. That 1 is looking down there. That's a 2. That's a 1. That 9 is looking down there. That is a 9. In this column, I need an... Oh, no, that's not a 6. I need a 7 and an 8. So that's a 7 and that's an 8. Oh, let's try and get that the right color. That can't be a 6, or there'd be a white dot here. That makes that a 6, which makes that a 3, that a 2, and that a 1. That 6 makes that 7 and that 6. And that's an 8. Okay, that was good progress. Okay, so 3 in this row can't be here by Sudoku. If that were a 3, it would have infected that 2. So that is not a 3, that is a 3. If that's a 3, that had to have been a 4, or sorry, if that can't be a 4, because if that were a 4, that would have infected that 3. So that makes that 4. And this is an 8 by Sudoku, which does infect that 7 as expected. Looks like this 6 is infecting that 6 to give the 5s over here. So that all seems to follow. And then 9 and 8 can go in. All right. So all right, if that were a 7, then that cell, no, be careful. Be careful. That cell does not have to infect that one. That cell could have been infected by this one from here. So, okay, well, Sudoku tells us that that's an 8, so that makes that easy. Okay, This cell cannot be a 7 or a 9, so it cannot have been infected by that 8. Therefore, to have been infected, it must have been infected by one of those two, and that one has to have been infected by that one. So that is now 7 or 9, but if that were a 9, well, it can't be by sudoku, but that would be an 8, so that's a 7. So that now has to be a 6. That I appear to have coloured the wrong colour, and also that one. Not quite sure how I did that. Okay, this digit only has one value, that is a 1, and that is odd. That means we get to place a 1 there by sudoku, which forces a 2 there by white dot. That must be a 6 by sudoku, and that is a 9. Why can't I colour these the right colour? All right. So these two digits are 9 and 3, and we know the order by sudoku. These 3 digits are 2, 4, 5. By sudoku, those are not 2, so that's a 2. That's not a 5, that is. This can only be a 7. So our infection went 8, 7, 6. It then infected one of those as a 5, and then infected the other as a 4, and then the 5 infected that 6. That 6 infected the 7 and 5. The 5 infected the 4. The 7 infected the 6. The 7 infected that 8, which infected that 7. That 6 was infected by that 6. Okay, so, and we know by sudoku that that is going to be the 5, that's going to be the 4, and that is it. Wow. That is quite tricky because there's potential to make assumptions that, that, for example, the assumption that those are both infected by it isn't necessarily warranted. Yeah, there's a potential assumption there. That is not infected. That did not infect both of those directly. It infected the 6 first, and then the 7 was infected by the 6. So yeah, no, I really like that. That's certainly not trivial, but I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Blobz, for setting it. If you enjoyed this solve, then please hit the like button. You can subscribe to see some more, and I would love to hear your comments. I'm looking forward to next time. Be seeing you.